Welcome back to Keeper Corner. My name is Bill, and I run Everybody Soccer, which is not only this YouTube page, but also my own website, which covers American goalkeeping and all things American goalkeeping. So if you're the type of person that loves seeing goals and loves scoring top 90 bends, this is not the place for you. We are all about the people that are preventing that moment from even happening in the first place. So in past videos, we've looked at specific goalkeepers and how they're developing or how their play style is. But today we're going to zoom out a bit and talk about something that's really plaguing the American soccer land base, specifically with the men's game and specifically with our goalkeepers' developmental tracks. This is going to go into some very dense material and can be kind of long-winded at times. So if you don't want to go through all of this, I'll just go ahead and sum it up for you now. Basically, we have two big choke points for our young goalkeepers coming through. The first one is coming from youth to pro, maybe kind of youth to high college, you could call it. We lose a lot of those numbers. And then the second one is goalkeepers going from either high USL or MLS and then just getting stuck there that end up being creating this logjam for other goalkeepers. So where we should be moving goalkeepers on and getting them into higher levels, there ends up being that logjam. So when we talk about the great goalkeeping logjam here, which is just something I made up, that's what we're talking about. There's two big choke points where we're not able to really tap into our full potential as a goalkeeping nation. So if you stuck around this long, it means that you have either fallen asleep or forgot to hit pause or click off the video, or you really love goalkeeping and really want to kind of know this big logjam issue with a specific number. So we're going to go through it today. The Great American Goalkeeping Logjam, as I said, is just something I've came up, but it's a serious problem that we're really getting plagued with. And this is just one of four areas here when you think about making a country great at goalkeeping. So as you can see here, the other three areas of having a thriving grassroots scene and an active goalkeeping director within the federation, and then also education that comes with it. Those three pieces are super important, but today we're just going to be talking about professional opportunities and what those should look like compared to other countries. So one quick example here is the current goalkeeping core for Atlanta United. Now, they have five goalkeepers over two teams, and also, to be fair, Jaden Hibbert just got sent out on loan. So this is a good example of them trying to navigate this. But as you can see, you've got five talented goalkeepers here at different stages of their career. Even John Burner, as you can see, previous MLS draftee, 10 years before Hibbert, which is great to see. But still a very talented goalkeeper in his own right. And you can see with the other three as well. You can understand a bit of a problem of how Lena would struggle to manage all five of these goalkeepers. And it's not to say it's impossible, but it can be difficult because they're all very, very talented in their own right. They have Hibbert for sure. There's a reason why he's a pro at 19, and then the other four, there's a reason why they're still a pro into the 30s and almost 40s. So not impossible to deal with, but this gives a sense of there are good goalkeepers out there, but the pathway starts getting difficult to move up, just as there aren't quite enough spots. So this is where the dense numbers start coming in. It's going to be wave after wave. So I'm going to try to walk through this as sensibly as we can here. But I've taken the four countries that, in my opinion, are like the big goalkeeping nations, Spain, England, and Germany, and Italy. And we're looking at a couple of different numbers here. So just going top down, that first row is just total population. As you can see, the US, very high number on that. Child population is just total children, youth participation. Those two rows, I had to do a little bit digging, so I'm not totally confident on those numbers, but I think they're good ballparks. And basically are just kind of percentages at the end of the day of the total population. So ratio wise, those will all look fairly similar. And then the fourth row there is goalkeepers per class. This is just my guess here of how many goalkeepers I think are basically seniors in high school. And again, this is just a rough estimate. You could say this, you could say that. England has such a high participation rate. That's why their number is a bit high. But overall, you can see, still very heavily US oriented. The bottom row, this is where everything is going to be built off today. So the goalkeepers on top 300 teams. You may be asking yourself, what is a top 300 team? And you may be smart enough to know that finding a rating system to rate every team in the world can be difficult because there's not a whole lot of cross-league competitions, especially cross-continent. So I've used, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, four metrics to figure out the top 300 teams. Club Elo, Massey Ratings, Football Database, and Transfer Market. You can just Google those. They all have their limitations, but my thought is using these four kind of averages out any sort of problems. You might say with transfer market and with some other metrics as well that they're so Euro friendly that you could raise critiques. I understand that. I'm just trying to be as objective as possible. I'm not going to pick my personal favorite 300 teams. So taking those average ratings out, and this is all done from the end of June to kind of give a end of the window sort of situation for most teams and leagues. We're just taking the top two goalkeepers from all those 300 teams to see where goalkeepers are coming from. And again, this is also a little tricky because some players and goalkeepers have dual citizenship, and which country they would lean. That gets a little tricky. So again, these numbers are a bit of rough estimates, but this is what we have here. So you can see from those bottom two rows, from goalkeepers per class and goalkeepers for the top 300 teams, very, very lopsided for for both the US on the front end, but also on the reverse, we're struggling it back in there. So the two goalkeepers that we have on top 300 teams as of kind of mid-late June were Matt Turner and Patrick Schulte. The other goalkeepers that you may be thinking of Sonina is Joypen was not included, and I also didn't include him in Chelsea because he wasn't in the top two goalkeepers there. So we just have two goalkeepers on top 300 teams, but you can see from the 60,000 goalkeepers per senior class, it's a bit of a problem. So you may be wise to know that most goalkeepers are not foreigners. Most leagues and teams do not use that spot to bring in international talent. If they're going to bring in someone from overseas or another country, it's typically someone who's scoring goals, not preventing them. So you can see the numbers actually correlate pretty strongly here. Germany's top 300 is maybe the biggest difference here, where they have 52 goalkeepers in the top 300, but then they only have 28 teams in the top 300. So that's kind of an interesting gap. But for the most part, very, very similar. And you can see for the US, those three teams that are in the top 300, there's only one player that could play for the US men's national team. There is technically some green card status, and I understand that. But when it comes to playing for national teams, we only have one goalkeeper, which is Patrick Schulte. So breaking this out even further here, and this is just trying to make a model here to kind of really show the logjam issue. So I mentioned the Massey ratings before. I'm not going to get really into it here, but basically I made these tiers and I gapped them out so that they got bigger and bigger and bigger to kind of have a funneling process. And so if you go into Massey's site, they've got a rating system here. And basically I just took that rating system and drew out tiers from it. So you can see top 20 all the way down to bottom of US Pro, so that's the last level of professional teams, which will just be tier 9 in this case. But building off this is what it looks like from league to league, give or take. Now, again, you may have some discrepancies about this or that, but using these four metrics and kind of averaging this out, this is kind of where the lines break off this. You might see that the NCAA shape just kind of dive bombs off the page. There's a lot of colleges, and I think we all know that there's a big gap from top to bottom, much bigger from any league. When we talk about colleges here, I am going to include them because I do think that they deserve to be in the mix, but knowing where that line comes in is a little tricky, so I just did my best to kind of eyeball and personal subjectively, I kind of put them in as best I could fit. So using these tiers, this is kind of where the numbers look at. So you've already seen these top four rows. You have the top 300 and up, but these are the number of teams at each tier. And you can see all the way bottom down, 192 for the US. That's all the professional teams, but also included the 89 colleges that made the cut. Again, this is just my kind of eyeballing of how many colleges it would be in. And we all know from year to year, colleges kind of go up and down. So next year, these numbers could definitely, will most likely shift. I understand that. But for consistency's sake, this is what we have right now. So you look at the other four nations and you can see how their numbers really kind of skyrocket as they're going towards the bottom of the page, especially Spain. A lot of teams. And this is kind of where the multiple metric thing came in because it's really difficult to find the top 700th best Spanish team. And so even that bottom row there is just an estimate because such a ranking would be really, very difficult. But if you continue to project out just on numbers, this is pretty easy to find. And you think of Spain has 30,000 clubs in the country, saying the top 800 are on par with, kind of middle to high college for us. I think that's fair to say. Now, you may look at this, and this is something I thought where I looked at the tier 7, which is 42 teams. So basically, that tier 7, if we compare USA to Spain, that feels like a huge gap, and I understand that. And that I can understand maybe some critique on this setup here and this model. When we look at what that 42 to the 222 looks like, here are the two leagues that kind of hit that spot. So for the US, that's USL, and you can see the transfer values range from 5.3 euro million to 2.7 at the bottom there. And Spain actually has five uh, leagues at Division 4. So you can see Grupo 5. And you can see the value is a bit different. I think, if I'm being honest, I think this is still fair. Maybe you could say, well, it's not quite 1-to-1, and I get that. But considering there are not only five leagues at the fourth division, but also you're starting to think of, okay, well, what does a transfer value look like for a player that's in the fourth tier of Spain versus the second tier in the US? It's difficult to really kind of put a number off that. And transfer market itself isn't a science. I totally understand that. So when we go back and look at these numbers, you may say, hey, that actually those numbers are inflated here and there. Fair enough. But this is the model we're using. So we've just thrown a ton of numbers, but we know that we have high participation numbers, but low representation at the highest levels. So how does that happen, and where are these log jams occurring? So like I said, there are two that we're going to hit on. But I wanted to first kind of break down the idea of how many spots open up yearly for goalkeepers to move in and kind of figure out some attrition rates here. So when you look at rosters here, this is just a simple breakdown of ages for the top 300 goalkeepers. And these are just goalkeepers in those, for the top 20, it's just those 20 teams. And then next column, 21 through 60, is just those teams. And you can see most of the goalkeepers are in this 12-year gap from 22 to 34. A little around 80%, give or take. There are some above and below. But using that 12-year range, I broke that out to say, okay, if we're thinking of just the start and the immediate backups here, not talking about the third stringers here, for those top, 300 and even towards tier 5, tier 6, for those clubs there, you're probably looking at around a 6-year wait for a spot to open up, for someone to step out of the league or drop down a tier. On average, considering that most of those goalkeepers are in that 12-year gap, you got two spots for it, so it's kind of a 6-year gap. But for those lower tiers, I'm using a 2-year wait. Again, you could critique this and say, well, it's actually this number. But seeing that we're kind of use some consistency across the board, I think this might help show a bit of where these numbers are looking compared to other countries. So we're using those numbers. These are the goalkeeper spots available at each place and their connection to each other. So the goalkeeper spots for tier 7 through 9 is what we just showed there. That's how many teams there are and how many spots open up every year. So knowing the US has less teams is about 84 spots, give or take. And then Germany's actually not far behind, is 111, but Spain obviously has a lot, which is great for them. They can get a lot of goalkeepers in for those tier 7 through 9. Again, tier 7 through 9, think of this as like the third division for the US or high college. This is a low professional level here, and it should be a stepping stone for goalkeepers to move up and move through. So you think of that next row, the goalkeepers per class, and you've seen this number before, 60,000 for the US. If you take that 60,000 and you have 84 divided by it, you get 0.14%, which is a myopic, very small number. Where you look at Spain, they're getting a high percentage, and similar for England, it's not a high percentage. So these numbers aren't, obviously are kind of all over the place a little bit. That middle row there, youth to tier 7 through 9 retention rate. But the fact that our 0.14% is so small is problematic, because from the get-go, we have all these goalkeepers participating, but we lose a massive, massive chunk of them from, basically from step 1 to step 2. But then you look at those bottom two rows there, goalkeeper spots for tier 1 through 6. Again, that's the 12-year wait there, or 6-year wait with there being 2 spots per team. So you look at those numbers, our retention rate from tier 7 through 9 through tier 1 through 6 is actually in the ballpark, 5%. You look at Spain, Italy, very similar numbers as well. So there's one logjam we've already identified, but we're going to talk about a second logjam here as we dive into these numbers a little bit more. So getting away from all the numbers and trying to get a little bit more visual with this is kind of what things should look like ideally for any country, that you're having young goalkeepers enter the bottom and then they move up, and some maybe make big jumps and some maybe take some time to get there, but there's an appropriate attrition rate. Well, in the US, it looks something more like this, where it's very truncated. So those red arrows, that's a lot of goalkeepers you're losing out on. But the reality is we don't really even have a lot of those top 300 teams. So the ability for goalkeepers to not only get in is a problem, but the second choke point is that we don't have that top tier for goalkeepers to continue to move on. Now, some of you may be saying, Bill, it's not fair for you to compare the US to the top football nations in the world. And they obviously have so much funding and so many great leagues and players, and they've been around for a long time, and this and that. So if we do compare the US to what I would say is kind of like a tier two goalkeeping nation set up here, I think the numbers will be pretty surprising. So again, the top row, top total population, we blow these countries out of the water, not even close. And as you go down, those US numbers should look familiar. To scroll all the way on the right for that goalkeepers per class row, so that's second to the bottom row. So we have 60,000 again, goalkeepers per class, give or take. Croatia's looking at 500. That's what that number is, 500 goalkeepers per class. And kind of lines up from how many people they have. They have 4 million people, not that many people in the country. So when you think of kind of class sizes, I mean, we have way, way more goalkeepers on the front end here, and especially compared to other nations. But when you look at their goalkeepers in the top 300 teams, this is where it starts to be kind of a problem here because these countries have very similar league setups to us, and that they don't have top, I don't have a Premier League that is on par with, Spain or England or Germany. They're a step down, and they only have so many top teams. So if you look here, that top graph there, again, we have three teams in the top 300, as we talked about earlier. Poland, Czech, Austria, Croatia, very, very similar. A little bit different in numbers. But when you look at those numbers of where those goalkeepers are going, I think it's clear to see and say that goalkeepers enter these top 300 and lower ranks, but then they continue on, and that they're able to move goalkeepers on. They're able to get goalkeepers into those higher ranks. So building this out and stretching this graph down a bit, you just saw the top half of this. You can see from tier 9 and tier 8, again, some of these numbers are a little tricky with the college numbers, but I do think this holds up a good bit where the tier 9, tier 8 are very familiar numbers. And you can even see Croatia, it really struggles for parity. There's a big, big drop off there. Um, and they don't have as many spots in that tier 9 through 8 through 7 as we do. But when you think of the goalkeepers they have, they're able to push those goalkeepers on. And so when we want to talk about, well, you can't compare us to those nations, here's some really good examples and good case studies of places that are developing good goalkeepers without the top Premier Leagues. Trying to get back into some of these dense numbers, really kind of amazing to see again the 500 goalkeepers per class for Croatia and what that youth retention to that tier 7 through 9 looks like. Again, we're at the 0.14%, so that's 84 divided by 60,000 there. And then on Croatia's side, they have 34 spots available for those tier 7 through 9 teams on average. And for 500 goalkeepers, they're retaining almost 7%, which is 50 times the rate of the US's, which is just crazy to think about how many goalkeepers that they're able to keep on. But then you scroll down and you can see tier 7 through 9 to tier 1 through 6 retention. Those numbers are actually not too bad of getting those goalkeepers, moving them up. But then it's the next jump after that, the goalkeepers in the top 300 where we really struggle, that none of these nations have a huge number of teams in those top 300. However, US goalkeepers get stuck, whereas these nations goalkeepers are able to kind of move on. So getting away from those pesky numbers and getting a bit more abstract once again, you can see on the left here, high youth participation numbers. That's the double check. We're in a very, very healthy place there. It looks great. We've already talked about the first logjam there where those numbers, even though they're very healthy in a great spot, there's just not enough spots for them. So we lose out on a ton of those goalkeepers from the get-go, really as they're turning into a high college level into a low professional level. Now you may say, well, there's all those other colleges, but then you can also say, well, in all those other countries, they have even more spots open because we know of the huge drop off that is from the top college to the lowest college. And I'm talking even outside of D1. There are a lot of spots there, but they're not at the level at other nations. And we could see that Spain had 700, almost 800 spots that are just in the tier 9 and up, or we really struggle with those numbers. And so thinking of where other countries are and what's appropriate, you can see that next jump to the orange square there, the average tier 4 through 6 options, we're in a pretty healthy spot with that. I wouldn't say it's amazing, wouldn't say we're leading the pack in any sense, but comparatively, we're in an okay spot there. This is kind of your USL kind of low MLS option. So if you think of all the goalkeepers that did well in the third division and the top colleges, there's an appropriate amount of goalkeepers that are able to make that jump next. But the bigger problem is we don't have anywhere for those goalkeepers to go. And that's where that second logjam comes in, where goalkeepers are trying to make the jumps or trying to develop or trying to get some traction, trying to get some minutes. But because those goalkeepers aren't able to move on, they end up staying and end up blocking opportunities for other goalkeepers to develop and able to continue their careers. So unfortunately, Microsoft PowerPoint did not have a bell curve for me. So I had to use these kind of awkward triangles here, but imagine these are bell curves. And I'm using this to kind of prove a point that we don't need to salvage every goalkeeper of the 60,000 per class. We really just need to make kind of incremental change, and we'll be able to really open some things up here. So using this theory that let's just say the average Spanish footballer goalkeeper is better than the average American goalkeeper. Let's just say that was true. The numbers game actually still adds up for the US in the end here. So you look at the bottom screen, we go less talented, more talented on the right side. That's where your talented goalkeepers are, and there's obviously fewer of them than the middle point there. So if we zoom in here and we think of those retention rates, the 0.14% is what the US is already staying at. And you can see right of that, there's more Spanish kids. That's where that red triangle kind of leans over more. And there's more Spanish goalkeepers that are able to make that jump. But if we were able to take 0.14% to 3%, now you can see that the blue actually starts being a little bit bigger than the red at that point. We're still probably a bit behind, but we're certainly in a much healthier spot. But then if you go all the way to the left side of 6%, the numbers game starts adding up where, yeah, y'all might have had a head start and maybe had better goalkeepers. But from the numbers point, we're going to get more goalkeepers in, and we're going to able to move those in. So we don't need to keep 50% of each goalkeeping class. Not even Croatia does that. But if we can get to 6%, which is very close to what Croatia has, that number will really, really start adding up for us, and we'll be able to have more goalkeepers that stay in earlier, not we don't lose out on them too fast. So I want to give an example of what things were like not too long ago. So obviously, this great cast of bald goalkeepers may be familiar for most of us, and you can see where they were at various times. This is a 4 or 5 year gap, so there wasn't one specific time where all these keepers were at this spot. But you can see that they were obviously at big club. But what I think gets forgotten a lot is that these goalkeepers were also going overseas. Now, you, there is some, obvious debate on, Pickens, for example, did not play a minute for QPR, Dom Servi as well. But Troy Perkins, however, did very, very well for himself in Norway. And so when you have these goalkeepers that are going over abroad and trying to play and do this, and that, and really trying to push their level, what happens in the US is the spots open up. So you think of those 10 goalkeepers. And let's say, and I know that they're not all going to top 300 clubs, but just bear with me as they imagine them leaving and going into a higher or going into another league. What does that do for us? Well, that opens 10 spots for us. Imagine if all those goalkeepers came in, we'd have a great league of goalkeepers, but also now these goalkeepers don't go anywhere. And this is the 2008 top minutes for goalkeepers. And you've got some very good goalkeepers here. You've got multiple goalkeeper of the year award winners. Ramondo, funny enough, never won one. I don't, not very funny. He should have definitely won one. But he's first time in all appearances. Matt Reese as well did very well for himself. You do have some foreign influence as well. But even they did well for themselves. Most of these goalkeepers are tied with national teams. And again, if those previous 10 goalkeepers that we showed didn't go overseas or weren't overseas and they were playing in the US, then there's 10 goalkeepers whose careers get very, very tight for minutes, and they don't end up being able to make a big run for themselves. They don't end up being seventh all time in appearances or making a goalkeeper of the year season. So this is kind of where it's like a trickle up effect happens, where when goalkeepers are moving up and pushing themselves to other leagues, this is what happens back here in the US. So we spent a lot of time talking about that first log jam with the lack of being able to keep goalkeepers in from the youth game to kind of that next step, the tier 9 is what I was calling. But really hitting this point home that the second chunk point is really, really detrimental as well. And as we just talked about, when goalkeepers go overseas, there's spots open up and goalkeepers are able to showcase what they can do. But right now, where things stand, we only have two goalkeepers in the top 300. We'll see how long that lasts. And that's the second logjam where because goalkeepers aren't able to go make an effort or aren't making an effort overseas, now things get choked out here in the US, whether that's with MLS or USL, that goalkeepers are trying to move up the ladder, they're trying to get minutes or trying to develop, but they can't because they're blocked from those goalkeepers on top. So you can see again that top row, goalkeepers per class, 60,000 goalkeepers for the US. Croatia just has 500 goalkeepers. And the yearly spots, even though we lose a lot of goalkeepers off that, we still have 84 spots available, and we should have more considering our country. But that's still more than all those four countries on the right. It's still more than Poland, still more than Czech Republic, still more than Austria. But when we get down to that final top 300 and the ratio there from those tier 7 through 9 to the top 300, that jump gets really difficult. So if you think back to that graph where it's youth to tier 7 through 9, we lose a lot of those. But that next step from tier 7 through 9 to basically MLS, USL, that's very healthy. But then the final jump to getting to these top teams, these top leagues, we struggle so badly at, and we're only keeping 2.4% of those goalkeepers in, which the next closest is just 16.9%, which is 7 times the US's. So there are two main problems to address, and as you have guessed it, they are related to the two choke points and two log jams they're running into. So for the top of this page here, for a country of our size, there should be more tier 7 through 9 options. So the problem isn't lack of MLS teams, to be clear, it's those lower divisions. So if you look at the bottom of the page, we really need to increase the league sizes for the second and third division places in leagues and teams. Some people may say, well, let's get the college game going forward. I definitely think there is a route to modernize it and make it better, but until there are massive changes and trying to do these small tweaks, we're probably not going to see a high development rate off it. It's probably just going to stay as is. So would love to modernize the college game, but realistically speaking, it's the pro game that we probably need to put our eggs in a basket right now. With expansion, we've run into situations where we've seen scorched earth policies of places are trying to expand and ends up just kind of cannibalizing, and it's just kind of a swap out for one team for another. Advocates of promotion relegation would obviously point to this to say, hey, getting more teams in and trying to move teams up, that would be the easiest way to do. Expansion does give more teams in. It is pretty slow. So this is one of those things where if we can increase this point here, we're going to be able to retain more goalkeepers, and then we have a larger pool to then drift up to these higher tiers as well. So the second problem is, again, that second logjam is we don't have enough representation in the top 300 teams. And with this logjam that happens in the US with the MLS and USL goalkeepers staying too long, you run into the starters aren't growing or aren't growing as much as they should be because they're typically the better players on the field. And if you're one of the better players on the field, you're probably not growing as much. But if you're on the bench and not playing, obviously growth is very difficult to obtain as well. So finding more or creating more pathways by moving goalkeepers out and getting those into those top 300 teams will open up pathways for goalkeepers here. But in doing that, you can't jump from the Revs to Arsenal. It's just it's not a very common jump. There are some exceptions for sure. But if we're being realistic of kind of what we should be asking of our goalkeepers, jumping from what was probably at the time a top, tier 5 team to a tier 1 team, it's a very, very difficult task and just not a common route. So solutions that we can look at as one, finding appropriate jumps for a player's career and kind of the micro side, just for the individual, making sure that they're going to a place that they can actually play at. But also from MLS and USL team side, not looking for a 10-year starter. And the way I would best position this is thinking, imagine if you had a college program and if you had a goalkeeper stay for 10 years or any field player stay for 10 years, yeah, they may get pretty good at the end. But now that goalkeeper and player is not only stagnating in their growth because they're playing against the same level year in, year out, whether it's college or MLS or whatever it is. But there's a good chance that they start subsiding because, as we've seen before, goalkeepers or any player that gets comfortable where they're at and they're not getting pushed and they know there's a higher level, you can see a lot of the drop off in play. That's not uncommon at all. So not looking for a goalkeeper that will play for 10 plus years is pretty key. For USL specifically, they need to become a viable selling option because right now a lot of those goalkeepers and a lot of those field players just kind of drift into MLS. If they can become a viable selling option, not only does that help them out, but again, creates more opportunities for goalkeepers here in the US. So last stat info dump here. This is all the numbers basically you've seen. And there's a lot of things to talk about here. I'm just going to stick with the USA column. Again, we have 60,000 goalkeepers per class. That's a senior class. We do wonderful in that. It's great. But then we lose so many of those goalkeepers from we just don't have enough spots at those high college, low pro level compared to other countries. We have 0.14% retention rate. And for a place, that has maybe a similar league structure of Poland, Czech, Austria, even they have a much higher retention rate than we do. But then you look at, okay, well, the jump from the available spots from tier 1 through 6, we're in a pretty healthy spot there, especially compared to Poland and the ones on the right. And retention rate is pretty healthy, 3%. We're okay. That's from high college, low pro, jumping into MLS and USL. We're in a pretty okay spot there. But then the problem that we run into is the second choke point. Goalkeepers in the top 300, we're very, very far behind that. We just don't have good representation there. We have a very low percentage of tier 7 through 9 spots to 300 spots. That ratio there, it's very, very low. Again, we lose out on so many goalkeepers because we don't have that top end level of play, but they also aren't going anywhere. So we lose goalkeepers on our front end with that logjam, but then we also lose them on the back end when goalkeepers stay in USL and MLS too long. So a lot of information, a lot of stats to think about. It's pretty dense at times. If you made it to this point in the video, congratulations. Good job. You really love goalkeeping. But I would love to hear a comment from any of you. So if you liked something that you saw, you didn't like something, you didn't like the methodology, if maybe I forgot to talk about a certain aspect, if you learned something that you didn't think of or consider before, leave a comment below and I'd love to take a look.